Hi, folks. Welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about Drylands Agroecology Research project in North Boulder with the Nature Conservancy as they sought to take an existing south-facing fixed solar array and turn it into an opportunity to grow herbs underneath and around the solar panels. To get going, just to let you know, my name is Byron Komanek. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. Pictured here is our small team. We are actually hiring locally for folks. If there is someone who's interested in part-time work as an education assistant or as an agricultural outreach coordinator, we are hiring for those. So please feel free to reach out after the fact. Throughout this webinar, if you are interested in asking questions, there is a Q&A that's available to you. So please go down to the Q&A button, click that, type in your questions. And at the end of all the speakers talking, we will be able to get into your Q&A. If you have direct questions for individual speakers, you can put those in there. And if it's something simple, then they'll be able to respond by text. But if it's something more complicated and fun to talk about, then we'll just talk about it together as a group. So our nonprofit, the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center, loves putting on these webinars. It's a fun way for us to be able to do outreach within our community as well as further afield. We record these webinars, as you can see at the top of your screen, hopefully, and we put them up on our website so that after the fact, if there are people that missed this, they too have the opportunity to come back, watch the webinar online at our website that's shown here on the screen. We have three main pillars where we do outreach to schools, 5th through 12th graders. So Allison Jackson, pictured in the top right there, she is our education and policy manager that reaches out to students across the Front Range as well as into the mountains and their teachers to see if we can bring them out to our site to learn more about solar and agriculture and how we can combine the two together. We have community events throughout the course of the year planned out. So not just these webinars, but also on-site tours. We have an event on our Be Original Boulder County event where we'll have local nonprofits and local companies doing innovative things in our community able to come out and talk with our community underneath our solar panels about what they're up to. And we'll have a farm to table dinner in September. So be on the lookout for these fun different events. And we also try to do outreach with policymakers because they're the way that we have change in our community. Tax dollars are oftentimes the biggest dollars that help to advance initiatives that are good for our climate and good for our society. There we go. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to see some of these different videos that are showcased here at the bottom. We love putting out this information. We started putting out guidance documents on how to have an agrivoltaic system, starting off with some financial considerations and what you would do if you were a landowner. So do take a look at our website to find out that information. Pictured here are a few of our different events, from the farm to table dinner on the top left to the kids coming out for educational classes with Allison. Agrivoltaics solar developer workshop, and then our Artists on the Farm program. As I mentioned, we have different events that go on throughout the season. July 20th is that Be Original Boulder County event where we're looking for folks that are interested in participating with us. You know, Amy and Nick, I haven't even reached out to you all about having a booth there, but you'd be welcome to. We have an agrivoltaic solar developer workshop at the end of May, as well as another one in August. If you're interested in coming out to Jack Solar Garden to learn more about agrivoltaics over a 2-day intensive course, reach out to us and we'll be able to sign you up for that. Our upcoming webinar, as we have a variety of webinars scheduled for the rest of this year, is with PhD students at Colorado State University. So in March, these gentlemen will be talking about their work done underneath the solar panels at Jack Solar Garden over the past few years, what they've been learning about, and share that with our community, especially around ecosystem services and grassland health. March, that's in March. In May, we're looking to have agrivoltaics and social justice webinar. And then in July, our friends at the University of Arizona will be sharing their findings of what they've been learning here at Jack Solar Garden. Again, there's our website. All of this is important to share with our community because policymakers take note and then they pass laws. So in 2023, yeah, shoot, that was just last year, right? So Governor Polis came out to our farm here at Jack Solar Garden to sign a piece of legislation that put $500,000 towards agrivoltaic research and deployment opportunities here in Colorado. We foresee more agrivoltaics types legislation, not just here in Colorado, but across the country. And we're hearing about it. More folks are taking notice of this opportunity. And so the more information we can get out and the more demonstration projects we can have out there about agrivoltaics, about ecovoltaics, about this co-location of solar with other societal benefits, the more that our policymakers can learn about what's possible so they can do a better job at creating legislation that impacts us all. Our small nonprofit is sponsored and funded by a variety of different entities. And I always like to point out the Walton Family Foundation, who has been extremely supportive of our work over the past few years, being our largest donor. And we really appreciate everyone's support. If you're interested in becoming a donor to Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center, please also feel free to reach out to me. So all that. Now, let's get to today's webinar. I have the pleasure of introducing three friends of mine, Nick DiDomenico, who's the Executive Director of Drylands Agroecology Research with her partner, or with his partner. We also have Amy Skanes-Wolf, who is was the Research Director over at Drylands Agroecology Research. And then Duncan Gilchrist at the Nature Conservancy, who's a policy associate there. All of this started, Duncan, maybe I'll just throw into this at your gumption, is that the right word? Just initiative. I think it was a few years ago, you gave me a call about this time of year and saying you were interested in doing a figuring out how to get involved with agrivoltaics. And we spitballed ideas for a while, and you were able to come up with funding through the Nature Conservancy to put this together and really help to push the forefront of agrivoltaics in Colorado by getting this project up and going. And then our DAR family here have been the ones that have implemented it, have been watching it, have designed this project, and will continue working at this North Boulder site for at least the next year. So I am going to stop there, and I'm going to pass it over to Duncan Gilchrist of the Nature Conservancy to be able to share screen and carry it away. After Duncan, it will go to Nick to talk, and then to Amy, and then we'll have Q&A. Duncan.
Thanks, Byron. And let's see. There we go. Can you all see the slide and hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. All right. Well, yeah, thanks to Byron for hosting this webinar today, and thanks to Nick and Amy for being on here too. It's a pleasure to talk about this project, which was has been such a joy to work on over the past 2 years or so. And I'm just going to basically sort of contextualize this project a little bit before I pass it over to Nick and Amy to talk more about the specifics of kind of what we did and how we did it. So yeah, I'm just going to provide a little bit of background information on kind of how the project started, why the Nature Conservancy, why are we involved in this project? But first and foremost, some beautiful pictures from our project from the spring of 2023. So just briefly, the mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and the waters on which all life depends. And we envision a world in which people and nature thrive together. And as an organization that, historically the Nature Conservancy has operated as a very large land trust, protecting land that has important ecological value in the face of the global biodiversity loss crisis. But, recognizing climate change as one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss, we've evolved our organizational focus over the past decade to include mitigating and adapting to climate change as a top organizational priority. And so as an organization that is focusing on the joint crises of climate change and global biodiversity loss, we are often forced to confront this uncomfortable, unfortunate fact, which is that building out clean energy infrastructure at a pace and scale necessary to reach Paris-aligned decarbonization goals is going to require a lot of land. And in Colorado, to meet growing electricity demand while decarbonizing that electricity demand is no small feat. So we're going to have to build out 5 times the amount of solar that's currently on the system, 3 times the amount of wind, and also enough transmission capacity to transport those electrons from source to demand. And we're not exactly sure what the land footprint of the build out will be, because we haven't yet figured out what the most optimal mix of clean energy resources is going to be that we'll end up building out. But a back of the envelope calculation anticipates that by 2040, clean energy infrastructure in Colorado could occupy roughly 2.6 million acres, or roughly 3.9% of the state's surface area. That's just a back of the envelope sketch, so don't quote me on that. But the point is, there is a landscape scale transformation that the clean energy transition will require, and that's a challenge. And so, but at the Nature Conservancy, we believe that it is possible to build out the clean energy infrastructure at pace and scale, while at the same time protecting natural and working lands and supporting communities. And we call this vision a vision for a 3C energy build out. So climate, conservation, and communities. And specifically, again, that is a build out that is happening at the pace and scale necessary to meet our climate targets, while also, being conscious of the land use impacts of the clean energy transition. So, avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating the impacts of clean energy infrastructure on sensitive natural and working lands. And then lastly, the transition should, of course, maximize benefits for people. Now, who would disagree with these values, right? I mean, these are in theory very easy to get behind, but the reality is that the clean energy transition, as it's happening, isn't quite unfolding according to our perfect conception of what should be happening. And so the Nature Conservancy is working at all levels, from local to state to national to international, to advance a vision for a 3C build out, to actualize that vision. And what underpins our work on this is sort of this foundational analysis that you can read more about if you just search Power of Place, the Nature Conservancy. But I just, the sort of key finding of this modeling analysis that the Nature Conservancy has done is that, it is possible to build out the clean energy infrastructure needed for economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050, while avoiding the most impacts to sensitive, natural, and working lands. And so, this is just a few more findings from this Power of Place analysis. I'm going to skip over this, actually. And I just want to highlight, we are working to actualize this vision for a 3C clean energy build out according to the 4 strategies you see on the screen here. So, in Colorado specifically, we're most focused right now on this 3rd bucket of things. So, advancing a policy for conservation aligned clean energy siting. But, as you can see highlighted in yellow, part of the Nature Conservancy strategy is also to lead by example with demonstration projects. Which brings me to this project. So a few more beautiful photos here before I dive into. This is our project partners, the full crew. So this project, what's going on with this project? So as Byron kind of mentioned, this project is funded by the Nature Conservancy through a grant fund that is internal to our organization that funds innovative ideas that have a chance at scaling impact towards our 2030 goals. So as Byron mentioned, I sort of reached out to Byron in the spring of 2022 to put our heads together, and consistent with Byron's persistence that we expand our imagination of what is possible within a solar array. we recognized there was a gap for this specific model of agrivoltaics that we're testing. And specifically, the gap that we saw was a model for retroactively integrating an agricultural land use function into a solar array that was not designed from the beginning to be co-located with agriculture. So oftentimes when we think about agrivoltaics, in the case of Jack's Solar Garden, for example, Jack's was designed and constructed from the beginning to be an agrivoltaics system, to be, solar energy co-located with agriculture. But the reality is that by 2030 and by 2040, a lot of the clean energy projects that will be built will not be designed for agrivoltaics. And that's for a number of reasons, including certain disincentives or lack of knowledge or lack of, business models. We're trying to change that, but the reality is that we will have a lot of solar arrays that have been built that were not meant or designed to be to coexist with other land use functions. And so we thought, why don't we try to test out a model for taking a solar array that was not designed for agrivoltaics, retroactively bringing in these additional land use functions. I'm excited to hear from DAR today about some of the, the findings from the research that they did at the site to sort of test the feasibility of this model. I do want to mention there are a number of other project partners that were equally important to actualizing the vision for this project that are not sort of on this webinar today. But specifically, another goal of our project was to figure out how this project might create benefits for local community members. And so we worked with Boulder Housing Partners, who is the city of Boulder's affordable housing agency, as well as FLOWS, which is a sort of conservation justice outreach group, to figure out how we might be able to leverage this project to benefit residents. And so, we were able to provide some paid opportunities, some educational workshops, and we are still not yet realized the vision for actually potentially making the things that we're growing at this site available to community members. There's some challenges we're facing in making that happen, but that is sort of still the vision for this project. So I think with that, I have a few closing slides here. I did just want to mention, as Byron mentioned, the reason that, another reason this project is important is because it has implications for policy. Our state government recently has been very proactive in advancing agrivoltaics policy through the state legislature. And, this bill that Byron mentioned last session created this agrivoltaics grant program. One of the projects that was funded through that grant program is for an agrivoltaics retrofit project. So, I think, the Nature Conservancy, we recognize that oftentimes pilot projects and demonstration projects can inspire policy change. And so, we are as much involved in policy as we are on the ground demonstration of this land use model. And with that, I want to pass it to my friends at Drylands Agroecology Research to dive into what we did at the site and how it went.
Awesome. Thanks, Duncan. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Nick DiDomenico. I am the co-founder and now the director of land stewardship at Drylands Agroecology Research. And Byron and Duncan approached me. That must have been in the late winter of 2022, I think, or the fall of 21, discussing this project of an agrivoltaics retrofit. Let's see, just a little background on DAR. DAR is a collective of farmers, activists, scientists, educators, and designers. And the purpose of DAR is to regenerate landscapes to improve life on Earth. A lot of our work is focused on this intersection between ecological and cultural restoration. And we have two demonstration sites, Elk Run Farm and Yellow Barn Farm, where we're scaling drylands agroforestry systems, managing cattle, sheep, chickens, and pigs, and also doing design build installations for public and private landowners to scale agroecological restoration, and really focusing on how to regenerate systems and landscapes that are that have minimal water supply. And so this has been a really fun project to look at together. the way that we approach our design process is really first understanding the goals of the project. So in this case, the goals of the Nature Conservancy, the goals of Byron from Colorado Agrivoltaics, as well as the other communities that were going to be impacted by this installation. And then we'll go ahead and do drone mapping to get base maps and just an understanding of the site. And then we'll conduct a site assessment and analysis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then from there, we have holistic design solutions that we're then able to create interventions on the landscape to meet the goals. And so in the case of this project, at the BHP solar site, we really wanted to develop a functional agrivoltaic system that could still absorb and store water and carbon, and with the aim of growing natives, medicinals, and hopefully creating ecosystem function like pollinator habitat in whatever way is possible. And we also wanted to establish this research opportunity, right? Like developing and retrofitting an existing solar array like Duncan is talking about from a site that was not designed for agrivoltaics in the beginning is a new and emerging part of the agrivoltaics field. And so we really wanted to create research opportunities for this process and for the development of ecosystems in particularly dry and arid climates. And then also to integrate community engagement as much as possible. As Duncan mentioned, this Boulder Housing Partners site has community members associated with BHP that were hopefully wanting to use medicines from the site and to engage in the landscape in some way, shape, or form as a way to have a relationship with place. And so that's something we wanted to also focus on. So this is a drone map of the site. For those familiar with the Boulder County area, this is just north of 28th Street on the northernmost edge of Boulder. And so you can just, I can't really see the roads on here, but Gateway Park Fun Center is just to the west here. So pretty cool there. Just some photos from when we first got out to the site, and our lovely friend from Namaste Solar was walking us around and explaining to us how dangerous the panels would be if we were to hit them with tools, mostly just intimidating us about the potential risks and dangers of digging or creating earthwork interventions around these solar panels. But also, as you can see, the site, granted, these pictures were taken in the spring of one of the wettest years in Colorado history. From my understanding, since like the late 1800s, we haven't had as much rain in Boulder County. So it looks relatively green, but you can see it's mostly, containing plants that aren't necessarily useful for medicines or foods, very little plant cover. And as we were kind of looking around at this site and choosing between several sites to do this project, my initial reactions to Duncan and to Byron were, gosh, guys, this site is one of the most degraded sites I've ever seen in Boulder County. There's no topsoil at all. It's a very gravelly, rocky, sandy soil in general, so it doesn't really hold water as it is. The soil is very porous. Beyond that, many of the columns that these solar panels are sitting on were needed to be put in concrete because there were so many large rocks on this site that a good majority of the pillars couldn't go into the ground. In a way, what I told them is this is the gauntlet of restoration projects. If we can restore this piece of land and create viable foods and medicines, then we could likely do this anywhere. So just kind of little background on that, just on the extremity of the degradation. Beyond that, there's a prairie dog colony, within the site. And I know that's a controversial topic in Boulder County as well, but just generally what I was seeing was, another challenge, right? Like another challenge establishing useful vegetation because of the prairie dog concerns. So we went ahead and did a site assessment. The way that through DAR we do site assessments is that we're looking at landscapes from the most permanent features on through to the least permanent features. to unearth opportunities and challenges that we're going to create design interventions to solve. With the goals in mind, we took a look at this site. And just some of the general notes that we noticed from that is that, there's about 12 feet of sun all year round in between these panels. So that's really the essential site, the area of the site we're looking to do design work to grow and establish vegetation. Obviously the panels are really fragile, but some different opportunities that we saw, there's a gentle slope from this westerly side down to the east. And so that's just something we needed to keep in mind with our earth shaping practices as well. A little bit of runoff from the road here to the southeast of the solar array, and then a parking lot to the north. So some small opportunities of moisture moving through, but other than that, the only moisture that we would be able to capture and hold on the site would be what falls from rain and snow. Then we did just one little note. We noticed this area in yellow that was of a bit greater vegetative quality than the rest of the sites. That was just something we were keeping in mind for our research later on. And then other than that, there's very little opportunity on the site to actually collect and store water. So we had to make every opportunity as viable as possible. And so that main opportunity we saw to regenerate this land by holding water in the landscape is the moisture coming off the panels. But the one, for all you, anybody on this webinar that is in the industry and thinking about designing and building agrivoltaics or potential sites for agrivoltaics, this site, an issue with the panels that we found is that the panels were not contiguous. So there's two panels that slope down to the south, and they actually have a small gap in them. So there's two drip lines from these panels. There's a drip line right below the two panels and then a drip line south of the panels. And so we were just trying to understand how to create interventions to collect and store all the water that would be distributed from the panels. Other than that, for us, the way I envisioned moving forward was we needed to store every drop of moisture that fell on this site, and then direct that moisture to planting locations that we ideally would fill with large carbon storage. So organic material in the form of wood chips and compost to really hold in that moisture to be able to water the plants that we wanted to establish throughout the season. And so then the design that we came up with, other things that we wanted to keep in mind is this view corridor, right? There's a road on this side of the property, and we really wanted to maximize that, to have this be a future demonstration if it went well. And so we primarily focused our interventions on this northwest corner of the property, but then just to have a little bit more scientific kind of data collection from the interventions, we put this other section of intervention on the other side of the inverter main wiring. So this whole section here could not be dug around because of the wiring for the panels. But we decided to put another section of earthworks interventions on this side. And the entire concept for the earthworks is that we want to use these basins that you can see in this bottom left-hand corner to actually collect and store the runoff from the roof panels. And to mitigate the issue of the drip line in between the two panels, we actually did a very slight grading from the center column that are holding up the panels into the basin so that all moisture would be directed into the basins from the panels. And then because this site is sloped from the west to the east, this spillway detail section kind of explains why we are going to have basically basins that cascade into each other, right? As we're going down the slope of the land, we want to use level basins so that the water isn't actually running away from the plants that we want to establish, but collecting right at the root crowns, ideally. So we decided to place rock spillways in between each basin and have those basins be perfectly level at the bottom, which means as they went down to the east, they slowly sloped back up to grade where we would put a rock spillway and then start digging another basin 2 feet deep. And then with heavy layers of compost and wood chips, as well as rock amendments and biochar that Byron had supplied, we created these batteries where with ideal circumstances, they would hold moisture, especially throughout the winter. All of the snow would melt off the panels and collect in these basins. And then that would be held in the compost and wood chips throughout the season to ideally be able to establish useful perennials and medicinals. But as we understood, you know, from the site assessment, we had to be very selective about what kinds of plants we were going to use. And Amy will talk about that more in a little bit. But maybe Amy, you can cue up the video of the installation. So just about a 2.5 minute video of the process of installation that I'll just talk everybody through a little bit.
Are you ready for that, Nick? Because
Yeah.
then if you can, yeah. Perfect. Okay, let's see. Can you all see this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there might be a little bit of lags, but this is a drone video showing the site. You can see all those concrete piers that are places where they couldn't drive the steel into the ground. And then here in the kind of the center screen, that is yours truly on a very small Mini X, digging these basins in the ground. We were using a laser level to help us stay exactly on level. So the rough grading was done with the mini excavator, creating these basins that then we went back and shaped by hand with rakes and shovels to create gently sloped basins. So that's the grade work prior to the compost and wood chip application. And then using our skid steer to shuttle compost out to the different basins. And then also along the fence, one thing I forgot to mention is we wanted to use basins to establish vines to create a moist microclimate inside the solar array. Then, you know, delivering compost out to the different basins and raking it even and flat. So basically just preparing the site, building these batteries, so to speak, that we aim to hold moisture over the winter seasons and throughout the growing season. And then next was wood chips. So something close to, I think, 110 yards of wood chips, around 70 yards of compost were used while building the site. And kind of on this page right side, those are the basins where we planted hops, honeysuckle, and native grapes. Again, Amy will talk more about the plant selection and the research program that stemmed from this project in a bit here. But then we even decided to spread the rest of the compost on this access area, as well as that could be an area that would hold moisture to slowly percolate downslope through the solar array. So where everybody's standing there, the site slopes away from us. So kind of from the bottom page to the top page. And that's just a nice little overview, scenic view to wrap it up. So thanks everybody. Look forward to chatting more, and we'll pass it over to Amy to talk a little more about plant selection and research.
Awesome. Let me just pull up my screen here. Let me. All righty. Is that showing up? Yeah, okay, perfect. Great. So I kind of jumped into this project a little bit in the earlier phases, but especially when we got to the kind of time of plant selection. And I think this was a really fun and exciting project to actually do with Catherine of Wish Garden Herbs, who isn't here today. So the two of us spent a lot of time together pulling together the list of plants that we were going to try. And just to reiterate a little bit the goals that were shared before, I think our first and biggest question here is, can we get anything to survive? Because part of the goal was just to create habitat and to actually restore biodiversity and health to this piece of land. We also knew that if we could actually plant plants that were viable economically somehow, particularly medicinal herbs, that would make the whole project a lot more viable to repeat elsewhere. And so a piece of what we were looking at was that too. Is it feasible to establish medicinal herbs without water in this type of setting? And could that be done elsewhere at scale? So this was kind of the test for that. And I will mention too, a lot of the natives that we also chose because there would be opportunity to harvest seed and sell that, which is an economic yield at bigger scale too. So that's really what we were looking at, this intersection of economics and also just biodiversity and bringing health back to the land. But aside from that, there were all these characteristics that we were looking at to help understand which plants would actually work. And the biggest one really was likelihood of survival. As I think a couple of people have mentioned, we did have in the budget and the plan to water these plants once when we put them in, and one other time in summer. And as it happens, we had such a wet spring, they got a lot of water, but we didn't know that would happen. So we were really looking for plants that are going to be drought resistant and not need any water in subsequent years. We also were looking for prairie dog resistance, at least moderately, because there were prairie dogs in the array. We thought that the likelihood of plants being able to reseed themselves in this dry of conditions was low. So we were really looking for plants that would live a long time, long-lived perennials, and then of course hardy to our area. We also knew that they couldn't really get any taller than about 24 inches or 2 feet because they would start interfering with the solar arrays. So we're looking at a pretty narrow subsect of plants just there. And then the final piece again, which I think really Catherine's experience of many decades in the medicinal herb world helped us identify which herbs might actually have commercial value if they were grown at scale. And particularly, we were leaning towards plants then that we would harvest the aerial parts of them as opposed to the roots, just because that's a lot more feasible in this setting. And then again, looking at natives that could be helpful just for collecting seed. And then the final piece that really went into our thought process was that by putting some nitrogen fixing plants in amongst the whole array, we were able to set the stage for it to keep kind of building and cycling fertility. So given all of that, here's the plant list that we came up with. I'm not going to read through all of it. You can kind of skim it for a moment here, and happy to discuss more as we get to the question and answer if you are interested. But you can see that basically it's a balance here of a lot of native plants that are very drought tolerant, prairie adapted, kind of belong in this ecosystem, as well as plants that have medicinal value and some crossover between those two as well. I will also mention, as Duncan said, a big goal of this was how can we actually plant things that might serve the community that lives near the solar array so they can use it. And we did do a little bit through flows of trying to get input on what plants people wanted. And I think our realization was that almost none of the plants that people really wanted would survive in this setting. So it might be more a retroactive figuring out how we can weave opportunities to learn about these new plants in after the fact. That site assessment that Nick shared with us gave us really helpful tools for actually looking at, okay, we have kind of in some ways similar water harvesting strategies and basin systems throughout the array, but there are definitely microclimates as well. And so, for example, knowing that prairie dogs are largely coming from this direction, in the very first set of basins at the top, we planted the plants that were most prairie dog resistant. And knowing that there was kind of a wet, fertile spot in the middle sections here already, and that it's a little bit more sheltered from the wind, we planted some of the slightly more tender plants. So again, if people are interested, we can get into a little bit more of those microclimates, but we did try and plant plants according to the kind of niche that they wanted within the array. And in many cases, we were planting 2 species per basin, and some we planted just 1, where it was something like horseradish or comfrey that really likes to spread. That's what it looked like more or less. And then I think the piece that really we're excited to continue to explore is this research one. And we really decided to look at this from the same way that we approach research through Drylands Agroecology Research in general, which is by asking this question, is this system functioning like a healthy ecosystem? And that's a really complicated question to answer. But if we narrow that down to 3 major ecosystem functions, we're looking at how well is it retaining moisture, how well is it sequestering carbon, and how well is it supporting biodiversity? And in order to answer those questions, we actually looked at quite a few different things. So here's the list of everything that we looked at. Let me just, Around soil health, a few different things. We'll talk about insect biodiversity in a sec, and then just how well did these plants survive for year one. We basically looked at all of this in 3 different test sites. So one was the actual basins where we had planted the plants. And in most cases here, we kind of aggregated them and collected, for example, soil samples throughout all of the basins and made an aggregate data from that. We also looked at the alley or pathways, basically the places between the basin and the next solar array where the equipment had been and where people are walking. And then we looked at a control, which was within the solar array fencing, but outside of the solar array itself. So an area that we didn't disturb in our work. And I will say, I'm going to share just a few of our findings, but really the value of this data is going to be seeing what happens in the long run, because hopefully what we've done now by intelligently setting up these basins to harvest water and jump-starting the system with organic matter is we've set the stage for something where if we do nothing, it's going to keep regenerating and growing over time. And our research program will help us understand if that's happening. After a single year, there's not a whole lot we can know, but I'll share some of the things that were interesting. So the first thing here is just looking at soil organic matter percentages, and that tracks with a whole lot of things to do with soil health, but one of the biggest ones is how well the site can actually hold water. Unsurprisingly, because we added a lot of organic matter to the swales, we were seeing about a 7.9% organic matter in the swale basins as opposed to 4.5 in the control. A little bit less in the alley, which is also not surprising since we did do a lot of heavy equipment and movement up and down that space. But that suggests to us essentially that in that basin, we have set the stage for a lot more water holding, as well as feeding the soil life and just creating healthier soil. The way that we approach insect biodiversity, which is also a really complicated subject, is kind of by asking this question. First, we came to this because we're trying to understand, how do you look at biodiversity as a whole in an ecosystem? And after consulting with a few folks, it seems like really looking at insects gives you a pretty good picture of what's going on in general, because they feed so many higher organisms and depend on plant biodiversity. And so rather than trying to actually be entomologists, which we aren't, and identify every single insect species, what we're really looking at is the dominant function those insects have in the ecosystem. And of course, there's crossover, but we're kind of generalizing by saying, are these insects pollinators? Are they decomposers, or are they predators? And what's really helpful about that is to see, for example, if you have a lot of predators in an ecosystem, you know that there's a lot of prey feeding them. So when you start seeing high and diverse levels of predators, you can kind of infer that there's some ecosystem complexity going on. And I think it is interesting to note here that even after 1 year, the number of predators we're seeing in both the swales and the alley are a lot higher, which suggests that we're seeing greater diversity even from the 1 year implementation that we're doing here. Likewise, a little bit more opportunity for pollinators, but curious to see how these numbers shift over time. And then I think the piece that probably is the most interesting and relevant from 1 year data is how many of these plants actually survived. And like I said, we did have this extremely wet spring. We went ahead and watered these plants once in late summer, but on the whole, we actually saw that most of the plants survived over 90%. So this is the list of the plants that actually did have a very high survival rate in that way. Here's the actual survival percentages for the plants that were under 90%. And what you can see here is that most of them actually did quite well. The only ones that didn't really were the cone flowers. And I think it seems like the prairie dogs ate them. That's what we inferred when we were out there looking at them. The slightly less survival on things like woods rose and comfrey, but we actually grew both of those from root cuttings. So in our analysis, there's some kind of description of the size and way we planted too. Same with flax, those were very small plants. So on the whole, I think what we saw is that plants did very well. We had very high survival, and it will be interesting to see how that continues or doesn't with a slightly less wet year than we had this year. I think really the applications that we're hoping to get in the long run from looking at these plant survival rates is which of these may actually be feasible to plant in other solar arrays in similar contexts, and see if we can actually get them to a scale where they're harvestable and usable. So that was the original excitement, and we're really at the beginning of that journey. now. So I will go ahead and stop screen sharing, and I think pass it back to Byron.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Nick and Duncan, for taking the time to share with us about this fun project. I'm looking forward to seeing which of those herbs wake up in May and June and get going so that we can watch them over the course of the season. Amy, you mentioned prairie dogs, and you mentioned that there are some plants that are resistant to them. I bet there's a few people on this call that'd be interested in better understanding what makes a plant resistant to prairie dogs.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm trying to think of, short of just listing them all, some patterns that people can look at. But I think, for example, a lot of those more aromatic things like the fringed sage, things that you imagine have a little bit of a pungency to them, like in the mint family, tend to be a little bit less desirable to animals to eat. And even in the case of prairie dogs, mow down. So a lot of those are on the prairie dog resistant list. There's also this kind of way of understanding. Historically, there were a lot of our native prairie species that had actually adapted to live in the overgrazed sections in the middle of a prairie dog colony. And some of those things are like scarlet globe mallow and native flax that you'll even see in our really like mowed down colonies elsewhere. So there is actually a list that I'd be happy to share that someone gave to us to help us plan this project, if that's a helpful resource to send out later. But
thanks, Amy. And to our participants that are still online, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to these folks, go ahead and go to the Q&A, type in your question, and we'll be able to review it and get it out to these folks so we can discuss it all together. The question for all three of you, what do you think is the importance of enabling a higher extent of plant, insect, and animal biodiversity in solar arrays writ large?
can
What's
you
the
say
benefit
the
of
beginning of the
biodiversity?
question one more time?
Yeah, what do you think is the importance of enabling more biodiversity of various types of species inside solar arrays across our country?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think like what Duncan was alluding to is that with this energy need that we have as a species right now, and the potential that more working lands or more natural landscapes might be converted to solar arrays, I think what we're seeing is this huge potential that the architecture of a solar array can actually be a very viable environment to establish useful plants that can be habitat for insects and birds. And so like sort of Amy was alluding to as well, those insects and birds in different ways regulate ecosystem and just allow for other natural ecosystems around and inside around the solar arrays to still have viable function. So even like pollinator corridors or insect corridors. So that's my quick take on that.
Yeah, and just echoing that, I feel like it's just really cool to see that instead of being kind of because the way solar arrays are often put in place right now is really detrimental to the landscape, and there aren't really efforts to remediate it. But if those are there, kind of seeing how it's possible to actually intentionally use the runoff to establish moist microclimates to make it possible to grow biodiversity that couldn't be there or wouldn't be there otherwise, seeing it actually as a resource that's like a positive opportunity, feels really exciting.
Yeah, and I can kind of, supplement like Nick and Amy's great answers that were sort of tailored to like the, the plant and animal benefits from more biodiversity on solar arrays. And I'll say too, something that I am excited about, like thinking about from this project is, how can solar arrays that exist in and around more sort of urban or like peri-urban developments, how can the land in those solar arrays be harnessed to promote, agro-biodiversity and actually help support people living in small cities and or towns that might be near solar arrays access food and medicine that could be produced on the land. So when I think about the model that we have tested, a lot of people are like very interested in seeing like row crop agrivoltaics, where you're integrating solar onto farms that are just massive in scale, but perhaps our model won't be able to be scaled to a massive size, but it could be valuable in another context. Say you're a city government or a nonprofit that wants to improve, food sovereignty and or land access for a population of folks, and that entity, that city or that nonprofit owns an array. How could they think about using that land to promote agrobiodiversity, to give folks more access to the different sort of types of plants and medicines that we might not have access to otherwise?
Yeah, and Byron, maybe one more little piece on that too, that I caught from Duncan, is this idea of ecovoltaics, right? So maybe there are places in drier landscapes or semi-arid climates where there's not irrigation potential in a solar array, but maybe an ecovoltaic array could be designed in such a way where all moisture is caught in certain pockets, and those useful areas are turned into these insect and pollinator corridors that benefit the other ecosystems adjacent to the solar array. So I think for us, it's understanding how these patterns can be applied to ecological stewardship of land when the necessity of building infrastructure like solar arrays is needed. So
I was curious, had you to do this over again, what would you do different? What were the challenges that came up that you were like, you know what, actually, this is how we did it, but we should have tried it this way? Or maybe what would you wished you could have done?
does anybody else want to start?
I mean, I can start. I think one of the challenges of this project, as us panelists are aware, is that we sort of had funding to cover this initial like test run, and there's a little bit of uncertainty now about sort of what the future of the project is. What does the future of the stewardship of the land at the site look like? I would love to see the development of some sort of like operations and maintenance contract that is like able to be used at the site, that might be able to like use some of the costs that go towards like maintaining the site to actually like potentially maintaining the beds, which we've designed to be pretty low maintenance. So ideally the cost wouldn't be big. But I want to see, the site sort of continue indefinitely. So I think there's a question around like, what is the exactly appropriate partnership model that might be able to sustain something like this into the future? I think that's a question that is still alive for us as a partnership. So
yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that I would do this differently in this particular setting, because I think trying a bunch of different plants was part of the point, to see what worked. But knowing how many of them did well and knowing which ones did well, I think in a similar scale setup next time, it would be helpful to choose a narrower palette to make that was like more usable, in order to make it possible for someone to maybe actually get enough yield on some of these herbs to do something productive with. But that was part of the learning for us this time, to see what worked too.
Yeah, riffing off that, I think you have a good point there, Amy, which is that if part of the goals of this project were to create an opportunity for communities to be able to utilize these plants and medicines, and maybe the challenge of balancing the research capabilities with having it be useful for communities was a challenging thing to weave. But I also just want to express my real I'm just impressed with what was able to occur on the site, actually. To me, it seems like the basins and the structure, the land shaping itself, is actually functioning better than any of us, as well as any of us could have hoped for. As we were kind of talking about through the process, wow, everybody, cross your fingers, hope something grows. Hopefully there's enough moisture to allow for anything to establish. And if there is anything, what a great way to breed drought-tolerant perennial plants. What a good way to test these kinds of practices. So in a lot of ways, I think we've gotten to see that the strategies that we've been applying to the project are working well, and a lot of data has come out of that. And I think we'll be able to see more as the years go by, what plants continue to establish well, what plants continue to fill the basins. And so that's my hope, is to be able to go back in a year or two and see plants completely established throughout basins, and even have more data about what kinds of drought tolerant, useful agroecological crops we could use on other demonstration sites.
Thanks. We'll go to questions that are popping up here. There's a question about pollinators. Would your plant choices be helpful, attractive to them, and were beehives planned?
I can start answering that one. And I think there's this really interesting question to me of like which plants are most helpful for pollinators as a question. And I think there's some things like mint that they're like a generalist plant. There's a whole lot of pollinators that will come to a mint plant or a catnip plant and eat from them. And then there's highly specialized pollinators that maybe only pollinate a yucca. And that yucca is not going to be useful to a wide number of pollinators, but for that very specific native one, it's essential. And so I think the short answer to that is that in my mind, every single flowering plant is helpful to pollinators somehow. It just depends on which ones we're trying to support and the goals. And I think in particular with this array, at the scale that we were at and what we were choosing, the support of kind of solitary native pollinators was maybe more of the outcome. And just for perspective, I have a beekeeper friend who's told me that in our bioregion, you need about 2 acres of continuous forage to support a beehive. And so just understanding kind of the scale that's necessary to support honeybees, and maybe choosing in some context to lean into supporting native bees a little bit more. But I feel like whatever plants we were adding to an array like this that was otherwise pretty degraded and unbiodiverse would be supporting pollinators more than before. It just depends what type.
Thanks, Amy. I know Nick is typing in the answer on this one, but there's a question from Lindsay about harvesting strategy. Is it going to be done by hand, or will machinery be done or be used? And then what would be the economic viability of the types of herbs that you were talking about, Catherine had suggested?
I guess since I was typing, I'll just kind of start on my answer.
Thanks, Nick.
I think just a little reframe, and then I'm sure Amy's got things too, is just that in no way were part of the goals to create an economically viable cropping series because of the water limitations. So more so the approach was, can we test plants that would be viable in these soil conditions after our interventions? And then these plants would become available for low-income community members that are a part of the BHP community to be able to harvest either for seed or for medicines. And Amy has a whole great thought process around native seed collection that maybe she can pitch after me, but more so that this would be community scale, community harvested, and not in any way designed for economic viability or production.
Yep. And I think just kind of going off of that too, a lot of Catherine's excitement in this project was to start understanding if this actually could be done at scale, and maybe even in a way that was machine harvested. But it's her realization too, as we looked at it, is like the basin form would make it impossible to harvest them mechanically, was what she had shared. And in a way, we're understanding that the basin form with all that living organic matter is what makes it feasible to grow them in a dryland system. So still, I think a lot of questions about if it would be possible to actually grow any of these species without the water catchment and the organic matter. I'm just sharing, I think, to represent Catherine's point of view. Her excitement is, I think, about the economic viability of doing this large scale, but I don't think we can actually draw any conclusions on that from this project yet.
That sounds fair. Eric asks, are there any crops that were considered for the alleys that grew beyond 2 feet tall, but could be pruned for biomass and ground cover?
You know, I think we were really looking at a very low maintenance setting. So we were sticking with things that we knew would stay within the height parameters without a whole lot of intervention from us to keep them that way. Not to say that that couldn't be true in other settings. I don't know, Nick or Duncan, if you have any thoughts on that too, but.
I think that's a great idea and something that we utilize in some of our other management systems. In this case, just factoring in the labor capacities that was fundable, and we were not using any plants and planting them for the sole reason of chop and dropping for biomass. But in a lot of other management systems, that would be a really great design solution.
Thanks. Austin asks, solar siting policies are increasingly pushing solar to denuded, unproductive, and or contaminated lands. What takeaways from this project may inform the future of establishing useful vegetation within these settings?
I'll start, I guess. Yeah, I think that's kind of the goal, the crown jewel of the. I mean, that's what I think we're all in discussion around. So I'm curious what everybody else has to say. But for me, I think the premise is when ecovoltaic sites are going in, especially in denuded or degraded land, thoughtful ecological design from the beginning is the most affordable and effective solution. So considerations of wind, moisture, runoff and erosion patterns, ecological patterns as a whole, other plant communities, just a general approach from an ecological and holistic perspective can do a lot to create more cheaper ecovoltaic sites. And one great thought I had was to somehow at different times position the solar arrays on contour so that the basins themselves were on contour and held moisture all the way through. But I think this just helps us to see that each site is very specific and unique in and of itself. And so thoughtful consideration prior to development is probably, again, the most affordable solution. That's my quick take.
I guess I would just add that, I think with this project, we are demonstrating a sort of counter argument to the narrative that like solar energy infrastructure can't coexist with ecosystem regeneration. And I think a lot of times, land is either degraded before a solar array goes in, or it's further degraded during the construction, of the array. And I just think we need to think more creatively about, considering this infrastructure as something that can actually catalyze and, be supportive of ecosystem regeneration. So, and I think in our project, we're demonstrating that solar infrastructure can actually be supportive of ecosystem regeneration. So,
I think there is this term of ecovoltaics, I believe was coined by folks up at Colorado State University, thinking about how can we co-prioritize conservation benefits, biodiversity, ecosystem health with solar arrays. And this project helps to showcase that so that for the future projects as they get built can be pushed in that direction. Next question I have here. How much shade do these plants get from the solar panels every single day, and how much sun do they get?
Should I answer that, Nick, or did you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, the way this particular array is set up, basically the basin is pretty much in full sun, and that changes seasonally a little bit to where like in the spring through kind of fall through spring season, one edge of the basin is in shade, but during the active growing season, it's pretty much full sun the whole time and was set up that way intentionally. But that isn't to say, I saw a question about this earlier. There are a lot of plants that would enjoy a part sun niche. It's just challenging with these stationary solar panels that it's not like that shade shifts through the course of the day. It's like a static line that's kind of on the north side. And so it would be challenging in this type of array, I think, to make use of like a part shade situation so much. But
so what do you all think that shade from a south facing fixed array like this, where it's not cycling over the course of every single day, where it's seasonally changing, having that shade over the panel or over the plants during the winter time, what type of benefit do you think there is there?
Well, I'll say just a little bit too, because I think one of our design challenges on this site was that where the water was going to collect off the panels, that's going to be in full sun. There's also this just need to have access to the growing areas. And so really the best solution that we could come up with was to collect the moisture off the panels. And that is inherently a full sun location. You know, it's interesting because with the moving panels, it's a different reality of water collection, right? And so again, those kind of infrastructural differences will create different effects that have to be managed differently with interventions and design. But like Amy said, I think definitely a lot of these plants would do better with part sun and part shade, though that's not really feasible on this site, which was one of another challenge that we were facing design-wise.
Yep. And I think just to speak to that, like certain areas being shaded in winter, I mean, that could be a positive or negative depending on the plant. At a very minimum, though, it is keeping the soil cooler, which is probably keeping it a little wetter on the whole. So that's positive. And I guess the only downside may be plants that are not quite hardy or right on the edge of hardiness here, but we didn't choose plants like that. So from our standpoint, it's probably helpful.
I recall Carlos from your group talking about how he went through there during the winter time and saw all the snow having fallen off of the panels and then just sat in the basin because it was also in shade. Then the snow really never melted, whereas outside the solar array, where it was getting full sun during the wintertime, snow would have melted away.
Mm-hmm. So some good
I think of that
insulation
as a
there
nice
too.
as a nice potential insulation layer for
Yep.
plant roots.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
Another question here: were cactus or cacti considered in this project or in our climate?
We did not consider cacti, and I think a part of that is just understanding that like the very high organic matter compost situation that we had created to store as much water as possible is probably not what cacti actually likes to grow in, especially much. It's a little bit better adapted to the kind of low organic matter, fast draining soils. Not to say in another setting that couldn't be supportive where you maybe weren't using this strategy of water harvesting, but here it was not suited to that. So
We have someone else asking about the prairie dog resistant plants. Maybe after the fact you can share that with me, and I can see if we can share that out further if that's appropriate.
yeah, definitely.
Let's see. Without the excavator, how many hours would this project have been in digging all those swales? That's a tough one to answer.
Too
Because
many.
that was a hell of a lot of rock in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of, well, one of the benefits of using heavy equipment is to be able to do the work of many men very quickly, or women, of course. I think that this project is not really feasible even at this scale if done by hand, except with 10 to 20 people at a time. And I shouldn't say not viable because, you know, projects like the Loess Plateau in China and many different projects over the course of human history have been done by hand, but not in the budget that we had per se.
I'm gonna skip down to Darag asks, is it correct to say that most of the challenges were related to the soil type and lack of water, not the presence of solar panels? And I'm going to couch this in, it sounds like this question is pertaining to just growing vegetation, period. So if you were considering an open site versus a solar array site, some of those different challenges, and then also the challenges of working within the solar array.
Well, and then also just that the panels actually create an advantage, which is that they move water to one place. So that's just something that we're designing and developing around, is that maybe the panels do have a use for eco development in a landscape, even if it is really degraded. I think that was a curiosity that I had through this process, is maybe dry lands, like unirrigated solar arrays, are really exceptional places to create viable ecological habitats again. Maybe not production habitats, but at least pollinator and insect habitat.
Yeah, definitely. Just kind of expanding on that. If you like kind of imagine, I'm making this up, but say 2/3 of the whole area is covered in solar array and 1/3 is soil. If we can now catch all the rainwater from that solar array and put it on that piece of soil, we just 3x the water available to those plants. And so I think that's just a really cool opportunity to understand in like maybe even a drier climate than ours, it may not be possible to establish any vegetation with like 4 inches of rainfall on a degraded site, for example. But with the solar array, you now made that 12. Now it is possible to grow something. So I think seeing that actually, as Nick is saying, is truly like a really unique opportunity to be able to establish vegetation without irrigation because it's getting more water, and or to be able to establish different types of vegetation that need a little bit more water that may add really valuable either crops for humans or just biodiversity to the landscape.
Thanks. I'll note in our Q&A for our panelists, there was a nice note from Nicholas from France, who had been listening in and interested in doing these types of projects in France. And if anybody else wants to say some nice, kind things to our panelists, I'm sure they would love to read it. I'll move on to Isabel. Isabel asks, could you share your thought process that made you arrive at the basins as a major design principle? Could adding compost and spreading wood chip mulch without a basin be sufficient?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Well, with a sloped site like this at about 3% grade, effectively, even with organic material, the nature of the site would be to drain the moisture away from the solar array because of the slope. So a lot of the work that we do in Drylands Agroecology Research as a whole is understanding how we can shape and terraform land to naturally hold more water. And this is just a really basic concept that many of us have seen in images of Southeast Asia and contour terrace farming. It's a really, really simple and elementary concept, which is that if we create places for water to pool, it can be made more available for plants. So in this kind of a circumstance, I didn't feel comfortable with just applying compost and wood chips and assuming that plants would live. And that's just a lot of coming from a background of work like Brad Lancaster, water harvesting from drylands and beyond. Like a lot of the work that many of our teachers and mentors have been doing in drought-prone areas is to use basins and earth-shaping practices to create viable soil conditions for plant establishment. Yeah.
Thanks. Steve asks if you all have any future projects planned, and maybe I'll just change that question a little bit. So what type of solar array would DAR be interested in working in the future?
What do you think, Amy?
Go for it.
Well, I think for us, the question more so surrounds, are there policy adjustments and is there government funding? Is there private or public funding to utilize pre-existing solar arrays as new eco habitats? And so I think for us, we're excited to look at different ways that different sites can be retrofitted to create useful habitat that's beneficial more from a conservation standpoint. And so, you know, we've talked lightly with folks in New Mexico and Arizona, and I think there's general interest. And I think the big answer also is, if solar arrays are planned, is there government or other public or private funding that allow for ecological design to be part of the process? And that's something that we're really interested in taking part in if people have projects like that.
Amy nods in approval. All right.
Yeah.
Austin asks about what are public perceptions towards this project, and how do you all see people supporting this effort? Duncan, maybe start with you on that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think sometimes it takes a little bit of conversation to get people to a place of understanding around like what the value of this model is. But I think once you explain to folks, you know, again, getting back to that gap that you saw really early on, Byron, around there not being a model for, you know, retroactively integrating these additional land use functions, from agricultural to conservation to community into a solar array retroactively. There is a lot of benefit to having a model for this. And I think it will grow increasingly important to have a model to point to for this sort of retroactive agrivoltaics conversion. I think, a lot of times when I hear people talk about agrivoltaics, people are sort of hungry to see examples of it working on a really large scale. And our project is not that. And so there is this kind of like gap in maybe expectation. But I think we're going to need a lot of different types of agrivoltaics and ecovoltaics, and depending on the situation. So yeah, I think that's kind of, I feel like that is the number one biggest thing that gets brought up, is like people want to see something that's scalable. And I think that I'm sure all of us on this call want to see a business model that's scalable, that can be used in our sort of heartlands of agricultural production in the United States around staple crops. And because that's where you're going to get the sort of like large economies of scale that like make this sort of thing economically viable. But yeah, I think again, back to a comment Nick made, like our project was seeking to test like the sort of the feasibility of doing this, not necessarily like to test a business model. So yeah, stop there. I think those are just a few varied comments.
Amy and Nick, what type of feedback have you gotten from the community about working on this project?
Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I think people feel excited about it just because they're seeing that solar is going to explode and keep growing, and just understanding. I think one big piece of it that comes up as a curiosity for myself and others too is just, even if we're not scaling it, as Duncan's talking about in these large arrays, it does represent a piece of land that maybe nobody is using, that could represent land access for someone who wants to steward land in an affordable way. And so I think there's a lot of interest from that perspective, and maybe actually using smaller scale urban solar arrays and how those can actually provide opportunities for people too.
I think that about covers it.
Nick's good on it. All right. If we do go with Duncan's thought on larger scale systems, what would you ideally see within it? Within say 1,000-acre solar array site, in your ideal circumstances, what would you foresee, or what would you like to be able to see within that solar array? Ideal settings.
I'll start and just say, I think there's more questions at first, right? What water is available? How much rainfall falls on the site? What plants grow natively and readily in the area? So it depends on what region we're talking about, and what condition the site is in. And I think that's where ecological design really shines. It's just like looking at the context specifically and creating design solutions that turn the challenges into opportunities. So I think it really depends on a lot of different factors, but mostly the process of thoughtful design is the answer, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Such an academic answer, Nick. Look at that. It depends. Anyone else want to try their ideal situation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, depends on what we're talking about, whether it's like from a conservation perspective or from an agricultural perspective. I think thinking about farmer sovereignty and sort of just like in the agrivoltaics discussion is very important, because in a lot of situations, I think developers have a lot more leverage over like what the array looks like and how it's designed, and are often under pressure to like deploy the sort of most low cost form of solar. They're competing against each other on cost competitive basis. but I would like to see forms of agrivoltaics that they are able to be adopted by folks that own farmland in a way that allows them to continue to farm the land in a way that's sort of their own vision and of their own volition. And I saw an article the other day that there's a project plan for a sort of like vertical fixed massive agrivoltaic solar array that's going to allow a farmer to drive a massive tractor in between the panels. And I mean, my first thought was like, well, what if you had a solar array that was vertical when the tractor was driving through it, but was on a sort of tracking system where it could go back to the ideal angle once the tractor has gone all the way through the array. And you could make that work with a GPS thing that's mounted on the tractor and tethered to the racking system, so that like the panels are vertical when the tractor's going through, and then they go back so I think with technological innovation, we can scale this to like the largest sort of row crop agricultural practices in the country. That's just one example, but as far as like the conservation side, there's a lot of things that developers can do to minimize the impact of the array on the surrounding ecosystem. So that's things like potentially not grading the land, and wildlife permeable fencing, and native ground cover, and certain construction and decommissioning practices that really take care to not compact the soil. And I think Byron at Jax, you've really demonstrated a lot of these different practices and the value of them for ecosystem services. So yeah, a lot of different ways to look at that question, but those are, I think, a few angles.
Yeah, and I think I haven't explored this enough myself to understand the opportunities and constraints, but I'm curious, I think, about just expanding grazing practice and grassland management under arrays, because I feel like even, for example, at this site, one of the things we noticed is that right under the drip line of the panel, there was big blue stem growing, which is a grass that in our environment needs a little bit more water and usually doesn't just grow in our short grass prairie ecosystems. You see it in rock outcroppings and foothills, but it's a really useful warm season grass that provides really high quality forage and kind of balances the grazing. And so I just have a curiosity about looking at, like, when we're putting solar arrays in grassland, which we often are, how can we set that up in a way that we actually start getting a little bit more of a diverse and mixed grassland that maybe enables slightly better grazing than was there before, plus free shelter for the livestock. But again, these are just curiosities because I haven't played around with grazing in solar arrays myself.
Thanks, y'all. We're wrapping up here, friends. I do have one last question that I saw come through that I'd like to pose. You all were warned about the possible dangers of being in a solar array, and yet it did not deter you from taking this on. Were there any accidents? Were you especially afraid throughout the process of the dangers? Could you just speak to some of the safety thoughts you all had throughout the process?
I was definitely thinking about it while we were under the solar arrays with pickaxes, and they told us that if we nicked the bottom, it would electrocute us. I don't know if that was true, but it was a really good way to make us feel cautious about working there. But it felt doable.
Yeah, the guy from Namaste definitely gave us some very stern warnings about how strong DC current is at the at the gauge of the wires there. So probably the most intense place I've ever run an excavator. But other than that, I mean, just don't break the panels, right?
So panels weren't broken and nobody was injured. Is that the sum of it?
No, every panel is still working as it was before, and not a single individual was injured in the development of this eco-voltaic demonstration.
Boom. Nick puts his stamp on that one. Well, Duncan, Amy, Nick, thank you very much for taking the time today to talk to our audience about this retrofit site in North Boulder. Thank you all for attending and listening in. If you are interested in joining in on future webinars that we will host, please go to this website that you see there, find the upcoming events link, and then you can sign up for our next webinar in March. And if you appreciate what we provide here, please consider donating. It's much appreciated. Thank you all for attending today, and I'll let you all be. Happy Thursday to you.
Thanks.
Bye, folks.